Welcome to Reading the Bible as a Muslim, the podcast where we embark on a journey through the sacred texts of Judaism and Christianity. I'm your host, Rizwan Ahmed, a Muslim with a profound curiosity about the historical context of divine revelations preceding the Quran. Join me as we navigate the pages of the Bible using a historical critical lens, unveiling its stories and reflecting on their significance for Muslims. Together, we'll unravel the narratives and draw connections that resonate with the Muslim perspective. Whether you're a fellow believer or someone interested in the Bible, this exploration is for all curious minds eager to bridge the gaps between faith and critical scholarship. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the history of ancient Israel. As a Muslim, there are several reasons why knowing this history is important. It will give us insights into the biblical text, but also helps us understand the Quran's engagement with biblical stories. First, the Quran considers itself, as well as Prophet Muhammad, to be part of a long series of divine revelations and messengers. In particular, the Quran and the mission of the Prophet are directly linked to the story of the ancient prophets, such as Adam and Noah, and then his seed from Abraham all the way down to Jesus. In fact, of the 25 prophets who are mentioned in the Quran, 19 of them are definitely Hebrew or Israelite figures, with some others who are debated. So clearly, the history of these people is significant for the Quran. Second, if we want to interpret the Bible critically, we should know something about its authorship, such as who wrote the text along with their historical context. To do this, we have to examine the history of the Israelites. Where did they come from? What was their world like? What were their concerns? What were their politics like? Who among them wrote these texts? And what were their sources? And a host of other questions which will allow us to properly understand the content of their text. Otherwise, we risk misunderstanding and misinterpreting their writings. It would be like trying to appreciate Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech without any knowledge of American history. Without knowing that African Americans had been enslaved for centuries and then held down by oppressive laws, we wouldn't really understand the significance of his speech. Consider another example. Imagine reading the Quran without any knowledge of the historical context of 7th century Arabia, Mecca, or the Quraysh, not knowing their social and religious practices. As Muslims, we're usually introduced to this background information, the contextual information, as children because it helps us better understand the Quran. For instance, we learn about the deeply pagan society in that era, characterized by terrible social injustices, a time when fathers would bury their infant daughters alive in order to avoid some perceived shame of having had a female child. We also learned some fundamental facts about Prophet Muhammad before his divine calling, how he was an orphan, raised by his grandfather and later by his uncle. He worked as a merchant, eventually married Khadija, his life-changing encounter with the angel Gabriel, the knowledge of his experiences such as the Hijrah, that is his emigration from Mecca to Medina, the Battle of Badr, and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. All of these provide essential insights into Quranic verses, especially related to community, law, and conflict. How about understanding the Constitution of Medina, which established a multi-religious, multi-tribal society? It can provide insights into the Quranic messages about coexistence and interfaith relations. Biographical information about Prophet Muhammad, his family, companions, and even adversaries adds depth to the understanding of Quranic narratives. Familiarity with the social and economic conditions of 7th century Arabia, including the tribal structures, trade, and treatment of women and slaves, is critical for comprehending Quranic verses addressing social justice, morality, and the status of women. The concept of the Jahiliyyah, representing the pre-Islamic period of ignorance, is central to appreciating the Quran's call for reform and justice. Understanding the culture and religious practices of the time, such as idol worship, pilgrimage, and tribal customs, illuminates Quranic passages addressing these practices and their reform. All of these historical and contextual details are crucial for placing the Quran within a specific historical framework. Without understanding this, we would find ourselves lost within many parts of the Quran. Now, the history behind the Bible is even more complicated because it's written by multiple authors, not just one. Also, unlike the Quran or almost any other book, its composition spans several centuries. So understanding who the ancient Israelites were, where they came from, what their society, their politics, and their world was like, and especially what their sources were, is crucial to understanding the meaning of what they wrote. It's the key that helps us unlock the true meaning of their texts. Now, the history of the Bible can be approached in various ways. One approach is to rely exclusively on the Bible, which provides an account from the creation of the world to around 500 before the Common Era, that is 500 BC. Afterwards, the Christian Bible, specifically the New Testament, recounts the story of Jesus and the early Christian movement during the first century of the Common Era. Traditionally, both Jewish and Christians have accepted the biblical account as literal truth, a viewpoint held for millennia. However, in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, European thinkers gained more freedom to question traditional beliefs, leading to challenges against the older approach to understanding the Bible. Presently, only religious fundamentalists tend to maintain this simplistic view. The shift in perspective is driven by a substantial body of evidence accumulated by scholars over several centuries. This data came to challenge a significant portion of the history as recounted in the Bible. Everything from the creation of the world to the origins of Israel itself has come to be understood differently than what was traditionally believed. This leads us to a second way to approach the Bible, namely from a historical critical method. This approach seeks to understand the text by examining the historical context in which it was written. This allows us to understand the mind of the author. By understanding the world and the culture in which they were living, we can better understand the text that they were writing. Historical critical scholarship makes use of a wide range of evidence, including archaeological surveys of Israel and the surrounding ancient nations, textual sources from the ancient Near East, literary analysis of the Bible, epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions, as well as social sciences such as sociology, anthropology, linguistics, psychology, and even hard sciences such as genetics. Through this approach, scholars seek to establish a more objective understanding of the text and the events that it describes, and to separate historical fact from myth, legend, and embellishment. This is how the Bible is studied in universities across America and Europe. Once viewed with suspicion amongst the religious community, this is no longer the case. It has come to be taught in Protestant Christian seminaries, and since 1943, even the Catholic Church has encouraged its own scholars to embrace it, resulting in a large library of critical scholarship from Catholic scholars. It should be noted that many, if not the majority, of the pioneers of this scholarship were devout Jews and Christians themselves. They were not looking to tear down the Bible or their religion, and frankly, that's not what a historical study of the Bible does. As the prominent biblical scholar William Dever puts it, quote, "Scholars did not raise questions of authorship, date, context, authenticity, and theological significance in order to discredit the text. They rather meant to provide a more reliable history of events in biblical times." Now, as Muslims, we can also turn to the Quran to see what we can learn from there. The Quran isn't a history book, though. It isn't interested in dates or genealogies or even names of people. Its main focus is on theology, wisdom, and guidance on how to live a righteous life. A book of warning and good news for the world to come. It uses historical figures and events mostly to draw lessons from them. So, using the Quran, you'd be hard-pressed to know an exact chronology of ancient Israel. But perhaps it can still offer insights into certain events when biblical accounts and the historical approach clash. So, with that said, let's take a quick glance at the overall history of the Israelites as presented in the Bible. Then we'll come back for details. We're not going to go into any depth here, just outlining the overall story. However, we will explore these further when analyzing each book within the Bible. In the beginning, the account begins with God creating the world, Adam and Eve, and then their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Stories which are also familiar to Muslims, though they have some significant differences. Then there is a bit of a time jump using a long genealogical account that ends with the birth of Noah. Adam fathered Seth, who fathered Enosh, who fathered Canaan, and so on until we reach Noah. At this point, we find that man has already come to completely corrupt the earth. Dismayed by this turn of events, God decides to destroy all living creatures and basically restart life on Earth. So he tasks Noah to take his family and a pair of all animals on a boat to survive a catastrophic flood meant to wipe out all life on Earth. After the flood, Noah's family repopulates the world. From there, we have another time jump with a long genealogical list, which finally gets us to Abraham. Abraham's father Terah migrates his family from the city of Ur in modern-day Iraq to Haran, which is probably a city in the southeast of modern-day Turkey. There's a conflicting account within the text which implies that Abraham was perhaps from Haran to begin with. Once we look at how the Bible was put together, we'll see why such discrepancies exist. But to understand all that, we have to know the history of Israel, so let's move on for now. One day, God, known as Elohim or Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, appears to Abraham and tells him to leave where he is and go to a land that he'll show him. Yahweh promises Abraham that he'll be blessed, and all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Eventually, Abraham settles in Hebron, which is in the southern part of modern-day West Bank. Here, he fathers Ishmael and later Isaac, that is, Ismail and Ishaq. Eventually, Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob, who we call Yaqub. At some point in his life, Jacob is renamed to Israel by God, something the Quran passingly accepts in Surah Al Imran, verse 93. It's due to this reason that the descendants of Jacob come to be known as the children of Israel, or Bani Israel. These descendants claim lineage from the 12 sons that Jacob fathers. One of these 12 sons is Joseph, who ends up becoming a vizier to an Egyptian king. This is also recounted in the Quran in Surah Yusuf. After this, he settles his father and brothers in Egypt. Their descendants live and prosper in Egypt for either a couple of centuries or 2 generations. We have conflicting numbers of this period in the biblical account. Eventually comes to power a pharaoh who enslaves these people. Sometime later, God sends Moses to free the Israelites from this slavery in Egypt. Moses, although having grown up within the household of the pharaoh, had fled to Midian after killing an Egyptian. From here, he is tasked to go back to Egypt and rescue the Israelites, who are also called Hebrews at this point. Convincing the Egyptians to let the Hebrews go is no easy task, so God inflicts a series of plagues upon the Egyptians to convince the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Eventually, he relents and allows them to leave, but soon afterwards changes his mind. He gathers his army and chases down the fleeing Israelites. His pursuit ends in catastrophe when God splits the sea, allowing the Israelites to pass through, but drowning the Pharaoh and his army as they attempt to pass. This is a story which all Muslims are familiar with as well, because it's recounted in many parts of the Quran. Now, there are a number of differences within the Quranic account which have implications on theology as well as the historical plausibility of some of these events, but we'll explore those later. After about 40 years, Moses passes away, and the Israelites are led then by his successor Joshua as they enter the land that God had promised them. Joshua leads them on several horrifically violent and genocidal military campaigns against the native population, the goal being to take possession of the land which God had promised Abraham many generations ago. After this, the Israelites are settled in what is roughly the upper half of modern-day Israel. Retaining their individual tribal identities, they divide up the land into 12 tribal districts. For about 200 years, these tribes are ruled by chieftains called judges, who help them fight off the remaining native population. Eventually, they realize that they can't overcome their local enemies as separate tribes. This leads them to join together under the banner of a king to fight off their many neighboring enemies. The first king is named Saul, who is referred to in the Quran as Talut. His appointment as king is recited in Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 246 to 248. Eventually, according to the biblical account, Saul falls out of divine favor after he disobeys a command from God. He was commanded to destroy a town and, quote, kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. He does just that, but foolishly spares the king and the cattle. For this he is told by a prophet that God has turned away from him. He has lost divine favor, and his throne will be given to someone else. Some years later, Saul is killed in a battle, and David, known as Dawood in the Quran, takes the throne. David conquers Jerusalem and establishes it as his capital. Now, before we move on to what happened after David, let's highlight the importance of David within Jewish and Christian thought. In the Bible, God promises David that his progeny will always remain on the throne, forever and ever. This will later become an extremely important prophecy for both Jews and Christians, because as we all know, there is no longer a Davidic kingdom. After about 400 years, David's kingdom would cease to exist. It would come under the rule of a series of foreign empires. This gave rise to messianic expectations, the idea that eventually a Davidic king, a Messiah, would arise who would free God's people of foreign rule. Messiah, or Mashiach in Hebrew, means anointed. When a king would take the throne, he would be anointed with a pouring of oil over his head. The word Christ, as in Jesus Christ, is the Greek translation of Messiah, Jesus the Messiah. So now, after David, one of his sons, Solomon, known as Suleiman in the Quran, takes over. Solomon's major accomplishment is the building of the great temple in Jerusalem, where Masjid al-Aqsa now stands. This would become the center of Israelite religion for centuries to come. To this day, Jews consider its ruins, known as the Western Wall, as one of its holiest places. As we will soon see, Solomon's temple was destroyed, so the Western Wall is actually the remains of a second temple built afterwards. After Solomon, there is a civil war, and the Davidic kingdom is split into two, a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Israel was the larger of the two kingdoms and contained 10 of the 12 Israelite tribes. Judah had the remaining two. Israel up in the north is eventually destroyed around 721 BCE by the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire controlled a good part of what is now the Middle East. The Assyrians deport the king, the priests, and the elite of the population to various places within the empire. Eventually, these Israelite tribes would come to be known as the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel because they were lost within the population of Assyria. Due to this Assyrian attack, many Israelite refugees flee south into Judah. Archaeological evidence shows a large population influx in Judah at this time. Judah itself doesn't last much longer though, and is destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. In the Quran, this event is recalled at the beginning of the 17th surah, Surah Al-Isra, which is also called Surah Bani Israel, in which God says, "And we decreed for the children of Israel in the book, you verily will work corruption in the earth twice, and you will become great tyrants. So when the promise of the first of the two came, we sent over you our servants of great might who ravaged your country, and it was a threat performed." The Quran's accusation of tyranny is reflected within the writings of several Hebrew prophets who warned of an impending doom if the people would not practice justice. The accounts of these prophets are actually found within the Hebrew Bible. One of these prophets was Jeremiah, who is recorded to have said the following: "This is what the Lord says, do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place." Such calls go unheeded, though, and lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah around it. Once Judah is defeated, the Babylonians deport the elites of Judah, including the king, the royal family, and the priests of Babylon. Babylon is in modern-day Iraq, about 30 miles south of Baghdad. This time period of the captivity is commonly called the Babylonian Exile, or the Babylonian Captivity. During this time, some books within the Hebrew Bible actually came to be written. And then, after about 50 years, Cyrus the Great establishes the first Persian Empire, conquering Babylonia in the process. The exiles are now in luck, because Cyrus allows them to return back to their homeland. Not everyone returns though. Having integrated and reestablished themselves into Babylonian society over a generation or two, many people actually remain there. The only reference to this time period in the Quran is found in Surah Al-Baqarah verse 102, where we find the story of Harut and Marut, offering as a test to teach these people in Babylonia some kind of sorcery. It's an interesting account which might offer us some insights when we take a look at how Babylonian society and religion came to influence the writers of the Hebrew Bible. Because as scholarship has shown, some of the Hebrew Bible came to be compiled and written during this period. But for now, let's journey on with the Israelites. Once some of these people do eventually return to Judah, they find it to be a shell of what it once was. It's important to consider that after 50 years, the people coming back were mostly children or grandchildren of those who were once there, meaning they probably had little sense of what to expect. As it turned out, Jerusalem was in ruins. The glorious temple, the one they surely heard many stories about, was gone. They spent decades rebuilding, and it is during this time when the last two historical books of the Hebrew Bible came to be written. They cover the activities of two individuals, Nehemiah, who helps rebuild the city, and Ezra, who reintroduces the Torah to the newfound community. Ezra is sometimes identified with the person of Hosea, who is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Tawbah, verse 9, but this view is debated within Islamic scholarship. During this period, we have the ministries of several Jewish prophets, none of whom are mentioned in the Quran. Their teachings can be found within the Hebrew Bible. These are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They encourage the people to rebuild the temple, which they do, and to turn back to God. Malachi, the last of these prophets, foretells of another messenger to come. Christians believe that this was John the Baptist, who the Quran calls Yahya. However, after Malachi, there are no more Jewish prophets that came to be universally recognized within the Jewish community. As far as modern Judaism is concerned, prophecy came to an end, and Malachi is considered to be the final prophetic book within the Hebrew Bible. This is not the end of the story, though. The next several centuries continue to be tumultuous ones. And even though we don't have any more books within the Hebrew Bible that cover this time period, some of the books that we find in there were in fact written during this time. We do have a lot of other written sources coming from this time period, so we aren't completely in the dark about what was happening. Even though they had returned from exile and rebuilt their city, Judea still continued to be under Persian rule. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great came from Macedonia and invaded the Persian Empire, which led to its collapse. This meant that the Judeans now came under Greek rule. The Jewish people eventually rebel against their Greek overlords and come to establish an independent state again for the first time since the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE. Hanukkah is a celebration related to the events of this victory. This kingdom is called the Hasmonean Kingdom, and it's short-lived. After only about 100 years, the Romans turned this kingdom into a vassal state. This is a period full of civil strife and unrest as the Jewish people once again come to live under foreign occupation. For these reasons, messianic expectations run high, and it is in this background that we find Jesus founding his ministry. In the year 70 of the Common Era, there was a large Jewish rebellion against the Romans, which ends in utter defeat. The temple is once again destroyed, hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed, while another 100,000 are sent off to Rome as slaves. About 70 years later, there is another Jewish revolt against the Romans, which again ends in total defeat, after which the Jews are banned from Jerusalem. Now, what can be said about the historical reliability of the events that are recorded in the Bible? How does historical evidence line up with the stories of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and Joseph? Did Moses actually lead millions of people out of Egypt, as recounted in the biblical account? Did the Israelites actually conquer the Holy Land through a bloody purge of its native population? Something which, as a Muslim reader, I frankly find to be off-putting and difficult to reconcile with the Quran's portrayal of God. We'll explore these in depth when examining each individual book within the Bible. However, to put it simply, there are quite a lot of historical problems that crop up based on decades of research by archaeologists and biblical scholars. This leads to questions for Muslims as well. For example, if Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, who did? And what were their sources? Clearly, they must have been somewhat reliable because the Quran agrees with the overall structure and even some of the details within these accounts, right? So why are the biblical accounts so seemingly accurate at times but apparently completely off the mark at other times? Does the Quran have any awareness of the sources behind these stories? Or does it agree with the elements that are historically problematic? And if so, why? And if not, then where and which parts does it diverge with? In order to understand all of this, we have to take a look at how the Bible ended up being written. That's when we can answer a lot of these questions. So to recap, the Hebrew Bible tells an epic saga spanning thousands of years. The major events it describes are the creation of the world and of man, of Noah after him, through which all of humanity was repopulated. Then of his descendant Abraham, to whom God promised an everlasting covenant and a great nation from his lineage. It continues with the tale of his descendants and how they came to be enslaved in Egypt and later freed by Moses. From there, it tells how these freed slaves came to conquer the land which God promised to Abraham. Finally, it tells of the rise and fall of the kingdoms which they had established, of the people's banishment to Babylon and their eventual return. As we wrap up the history of ancient Israel according to the Hebrew Bible, it's time to dive into an even more intriguing tale, the origin of the Bible itself. When, during this whole period that we covered, did people come to write it? Who were its authors? What were they trying to say? What were their sources? Exploring these questions leads us to a fascinating tale of how the Bible came to exist. Afterwards, we can take a look at what historians can tell us about the historical reliability of all of these events. So join me next time as we explore the creation of the Bible.